Chapter 6 1994 He lives in New York now. In May, he graduated from the architecture program at Columbia. He has been working since then for a firm in Midtown with celebrated large-scale commissions to its name. It's not the sort of job he had envisioned for himself as a student. Designing and renovating private residences was what he had wanted to do. That might come later, his advisors have told him. For now, it was important to apprentice with the big names. And so, facing the tawny brick wall of a neighboring building across the airshaft, he works with a team on designs for hotels and museums and corporate headquarters in cities he has never seen. Brussels, Buenos Aires, Abu Dhabi, Hong Kong. His contributions are incidental and never fully his own. A stairwell, a skylight, a corridor, an air conditioning duct. Still, he knows that each component of a building, however small, is nevertheless essential. He finds it gratifying that after all his years of schooling, all his crits and unbuilt projects, his efforts are to have some practical end. He typically works late into his evenings, and on most of his weekends draws designs on the computer, drafting plans, writing specifications, building styrofoam and cardboard models to scale. He goes home to a studio in Morningside Heights, with 2 windows facing west on Amsterdam Avenue. The entrance is easy to miss, a scratched-up glass door between a newsstand and a nail salon. It's the first apartment he has to himself after an evolving chain of roommates all through college and graduate school. There is so much street noise that when he is on the phone and the windows are open, people often ask if he is calling from a payphone. The kitchen is built into what should have been an entryway, a space so small that the refrigerator stands several feet away, over by the bathroom door. On the stove sits a tea kettle he has never filled with water, and on the countertop a toaster he has never plugged in. His parents are distressed by how little money he makes, and occasionally his father sends him checks in the mail to help him with his rent, his credit card bills. They had been disappointed that he had gone to Columbia. They had hoped that he would choose MIT, the other architecture program to which he had been accepted. But after 4 years in New Haven, he didn't want to move back to Massachusetts, to the one city in America his parents know. He didn't want to attend his father's alma mater and live in an apartment in Central Square as his parents once had, and revisit the streets about which his parents speak nostalgically. He didn't want to go home on weekends, to go with them to pujas and Bengali parties, to remain unquestionably in their world. He prefers New York, a place which his parents do not know well, whose beauty they are blind to, which they fear. He had come to know the city slightly during his years at Yale, on visits with architecture classes. He had been to a few parties at Columbia. Sometimes he and Ruth would ride in on Metro North, and they would go to museums or to the village or to browse for books at the Strand. But as a child he had been to New York only once with his family, a trip that had given him no sense of what the city was like. They had gone one weekend to visit Bengali friends who lived in Queens. The friends had given his family a tour of Manhattan. Gogol had been 10 years old, Sonia 4. "I want to see Sesame Street," Sonia had said, believing that it was an actual landmark in the city, and she had cried when Gogol had laughed at her, saying it didn't exist. On the tour, they were driven past sites like Rockefeller Center and Central Park and the Empire State Building, and Gogol had ducked his head below the car's window to try to see how tall the buildings were. His parents had remarked endlessly at the amount of traffic, the pedestrians, the noise. Calcutta was no worse, they had said. He remembered wanting to get out and go to the top of one of the skyscrapers, the way his father had once taken him to the top of the Prudential Tower in Boston when he was little. But they were allowed out of the car only once they got to Lexington Avenue, to eat lunch at an Indian restaurant, and then to buy Indian groceries and polyester saris and 220-volt appliances to give to relatives in Calcutta. This, to his parents, was what one came to Manhattan to do. He remembered wishing that his parents would walk through the park, take him to the Museum of Natural History to see the dinosaurs, ride the subway even. But they had had no interest in such things. One night, Evan, one of the draftsmen at work with whom he is friendly, talks him into going to a party. Evan tells Gogol that it's an apartment worth seeing, a Tribeca loft that happens to be designed by one of the partners at the firm. The host of the party, Russell, an old friend of Evan, works for the UN and has spent several years in Kenya, and, as a result, the loft is filled with an impressive collection of African furniture and sculpture and masks. Gogol imagines that it will be a party of hundreds filling up a vast space, the sort of party where he might arrive and leave undetected. But by the time Gogol and Ivan get there, the party is nearly over, and there are only a dozen or so people sitting around a low coffee table, surrounded by cushions, eating pickled over grapes and cheese. At one point, Russell, who is diabetic, raises his shirt and injects himself in the stomach with insulin. Beside Russell is a woman Gogol can't stop looking at. She is kneeling on the floor at Russell's side, spreading a generous amount of brie on a cracker, paying no attention to what Russell is doing. Instead, she is arguing with a man on the other side of the coffee table about a movie by Ben Bunyol. "Oh, come on," she keeps saying. "It was brilliant." At once strident and flirtatious, she is a little bit drunk. She has dirty blonde hair gathered sloppily into a bun, strands falling randomly, attractively around her face. Her forehead is high and smooth, her jawbones sloping and unusually long. Her eyes are greenish, and the irises encased by thin rings of black. She is dressed in silk capri pants and a sleeveless white shirt that shows off her tan. "What do you think of it?" she asks Gogol, drawing him without warning into the discussion. When he tells her he hasn't seen the film, she looks away. She approaches him again as he is standing idle, looking up at an imposing wooden mask that hangs above a suspended metal staircase. The hollow diamond-shaped eyes and mouth of the mask revealing the white brick wall behind it. "There's an even scarier one in the bedroom," she says, making a face, shuddering. Imagine opening your eyes and seeing something like that the first thing in the morning. The way she says this makes him wonder if she speaks from experience, if she's Russell's lover, or ex-lover, if that is what she is implying. Her name is Maxine. She asks him about the program at Columbia, mentioning that she had gone to Bernard for college, majoring in art history. She leans back against a column as she speaks, smiling at him easily, drinking a glass of champagne. At first, he assumes she is older than he is, closer to 30 than 20. He is surprised to learn that she had graduated from college the year after he had started graduate school, that for a year they overlapped at Columbia, living just 3 blocks away from each other, and that they have in all likelihood crossed paths on Broadway or walking up the steps of Low Library or in Avery. It reminds him of Ruth, of the way they too had once lived in such close proximity as strangers. Maxine tells him she works as an assistant editor for a publisher of art books. Her current project is a book on Andrea Mantegna, and he impresses her, remembering correctly that his frescoes are in Mantua, in the Palazzo Ducale. They speak in that slightly strained, silly way that he associates it now with flirtation. The exchange feels desperately arbitrary, fleeting. It is the sort of conversation he might have had with anybody. But Maxine has a way of focusing her attention on him completely, her pale, watchful eyes holding his gaze, making him feel, for those brief minutes, the absolute center of the world. The next morning, she calls him, waking him at 10 on a Sunday. He is still in bed, his head aching from the scotch and sodas he had consumed throughout the evening. He answers gruffly, a bit impatiently, expecting it to be his mother calling to ask how his week has been. He has the feeling, from the tone of Maxine's voice, that she had been up for hours, that her breakfast has already been eaten, her Times thoroughly read. "It's Maxine, from last night," she says, not bothering to apologize for waking him. She tells him she had found his number in the phone book, though he doesn't remember telling her his last name. "God, your apartment's noisy," she remarks. Then, without awkwardness or pause, she invites him to dinner at her place. She specifies the evening. A Friday, tells him the address, somewhere in Chelsea. He assumes it will be a dinner party, asks if there's anything he can bring, but she says no, it will be just him. "I should probably warn you that I live with my parents," she adds. Oh. This unexpected piece of information deflates him, confuses him. He asks if her parents will mind his coming over, if perhaps they should meet at a restaurant instead. But she laughs at this suggestion in a way that makes him feel vaguely foolish. Why on earth would they mind? He takes a cab from his office to her neighborhood, getting out at a liquor store to buy a bottle of wine. It is a cool evening in September, raining steadily, the summer's leaves still plentiful on the trees. He turns onto a remote, tranquil block between 9th and 10th Avenues. It is his first date in a long time. With the exception of a few forgettable affairs at Columbia, he has been with no one seriously since Ruth. He doesn't know what to make of the whole arrangement with Maxine, but as odd as the terms of the invitation seem, he had been unable to refuse. He is curious about her, attracted, flattered by the boldness of her pursuit. He is stunned by the house, a Greek revival, admiring it for several minutes, like a tourist, before opening the gate. He notes the pedimented window lintels, the Doric pilasters, the bracketed entablature, the black cruciform paneled door. He climbs a low stoop with cast iron railings. The name below the bell is Ratliff. Several minutes after he presses it, enough to make him double-check the address on the scrap of paper in his jacket pocket, Maxine arrives. She kisses him on the cheek, leaning forward toward him on one foot, the other leg extended, slightly raised behind her. She is barefoot, wearing flowing black wool pants and a thin beige cardigan. As far as he can tell, she wears nothing under the cardigan, apart from her bra. Her hair is done up in the same careless way. His raincoat is draped on a coat rack, his folding umbrella dropped into a stand. He glimpses himself quickly in a mirror in the foyer, smoothing his hair and his tie. She leads him down a flight of stairs to a kitchen that appears to occupy an entire floor of the house, with a large farmhouse table at one end, and, beyond that, French doors leading to a garden. The walls are adorned with prints of roosters and herbs, and an arrangement of copper skillets. Ceramic plates and platters are displayed on open shelves, along with what seems to be hundreds of cookbooks, food encyclopedias, and volumes of essays about eating. A woman stands at a butcher block island by the appliances, sniping the ends of a pile of green beans with a pair of scissors. "This is my mother, Lydia," Maxine says, "and this is Silas," she tells him, pointing to a reddish-brown cocker spaniel dozing under the table. Lydia is tall and slender, like her daughter, with straight iron-colored hair cut youthfully to frame her face. She is carefully dressed, with gold jewelry at her ears and throat, a navy apron wrapped around her waist, gleaming black leather shoes. Though her face is lined and her complexion a bit splotchy, she is more beautiful even than Maxine, her features more regular, the cheekbones higher, and the eyes more elegantly defined. "Lovely to meet you, Nikhil," she says, smiling brightly, and though she looks at him with interest, she does not pause in her work or offer to shake his hand. Maxine pours him a glass of wine, not asking if perhaps he might prefer something else. "Come on," she says, "I'll show you the house." She leads him up 5 flights of uncarpeted stairs that creak noisily beneath their combined weight. The plan of the house is simple: 2 immense rooms per floor, each of which, he is certain, is larger than his own apartment. Politely he admires the plaster cove mouldings, the ceiling medallions, the marble mantelpieces, things he knows how to speak intelligently and at length about. The walls are painted in flamboyant colors, hibiscus pink, lilac pistachio, and are crowded with clusters of paintings and drawings and photographs. In one room he sees an oil portrait of a small girl he assumes is Maxine, sitting in the lap of a stunning youthful Lydia, wearing a yellow sleeveless dress. Along the hallways, on every floor, shelves ascend to the ceiling, crammed with all the novels one should read in a lifetime, biographies, massive monographs of every artist, all the architecture books Gogol has ever coveted. Alongside the clutter, there is a starkness about the place that appeals to him. The floors are bare, the woodwork stripped, many of the windows without curtains to highlight their generous proportions. Maxine has the top floor to herself, a peach-colored bedroom with a sleigh bed at the back, a long black and red bathroom. The shelf above the sink is full of different creams for her neck, her throat, her eyes, her feet, daytime, nighttime, sun and shade. Though the bedroom is a grey sitting room she treats as a closet, her shoes and handbags and clothes are scattered across the floor, piled on a fainting couch, spilling over the backs of chairs. These patches of disorder make no difference. It is a house too spectacular to suffer distraction, forgiving of oversight and mess. "Lovely phrase-band windows," he comments, looking toward the ceiling. She turns to him, puzzled. "What?" "That's what those are called," he explains, pointing. "They are fairly common in houses from this period." She looks up, and then at him, seeming impressed. "I never knew that." He sits with Maxine on the fainting couch, leafing through a coffee table book she had helped to edit on 18th century French wallpapers. On one side of the book, resting on each of their knees, she tells him this is the house she has grown up in, mentioning casually that she had moved back 6 months ago after living with a man in Boston, an arrangement that had not worked out. When he asks if she plans to look for a place of her own, she says it hasn't occurred to her. "It's such a bother renting a place in the city," she says. "Besides, I love this house. There's really nowhere else I'd rather live." For all her sophistication, he finds the fact that she has moved back with her parents after a love affair has soured endearingly old-fashioned. It is something he cannot picture himself doing at this stage in his life. At dinner he meets her father, a tall, good-looking man with luxuriant white hair. Maxine's pale green-grey eyes, thin rectangular glasses perched halfway down his nose. "How do you do? I'm Gerald," he says, nodding, shaking Gogol's hand. Gerald gives him a bunch of cutlery and cloth napkins and asks him to set the table. Gogol does as he is told, aware that he is touching the everyday possessions of a family he barely knows. "You'll sit here, Nikhil," Gerald says, pointing to a chair once the silverware is laid. Gogol takes his place on one side of the table, across from Maxine. Gerald and Lydia are at either end. Gogol had skipped lunch that day in order to leave the office in time for the date with Maxine, and already the wine, at once heavier and smoother than what he is used to drinking, has gone to his head. He feels a pleasant ache at his temples and a sudden gratitude for the day and where it has brought him. Maxine lights a pair of candles. Gerald tops off the wine. Lydia serves the food on broad white plates. A thin piece of steak rolled into a bundle and tied with string, sitting in a pool of dark sauce. The green beans boiled so that they are still crisp. A bowl of small, round, roasted red potatoes is passed around, and, afterward, a salad. They eat appreciatively, commenting on the tenderness of the meat, the freshness of the beans. His own mother would have never served so few dishes to a guest. She would have kept her eyes trained on Maxine's plate, insisting she have seconds and then thirds. The table would have been lined with a row of serving bowls so that people could help themselves. But Lydia pays no attention to Gogol's plate. She makes no announcement indicating that there is more. Silas sits at Lydia's feet as they eat, and at one point Lydia slices off a generous portion of her meat and feeds it to him off of her palm. The four of them go quickly through two bottles of wine, then move on to a third. The Ratcliffes are vociferous at the table, opinionated about things his own parents are indifferent to: movies, exhibits at museums, good restaurants, the design of everyday things. They speak of New York, of stores and neighborhoods and buildings they either despise or love, with an intimacy and ease that makes Gogol feel as if he barely knows the city. They speak about the house which Gerald and Lydia bought back in the 70s, when no one wanted to live in the area, about the history of the neighborhood, and about Clement Clark Moore, who Gerald explains was a professor of classics at the seminary across the street. He was the person responsible for local residential zoning, Gerald says. That and writing "'Twas the Night Before Christmas", of course. Gogol is unaccustomed to this sort of talk at mealtimes, to the indulgent ritual of the lingering meal, the pleasant aftermath of bottles and crumbs and empty glasses that clutter the table. Something tells him that none of this is for his benefit, that this is the way the Ratcliffes eat every night. Gerald is a lawyer. Lydia is a curator of textiles at the Met. They are at once satisfied and intrigued by his background, by his years at Yale and Columbia, his career as an architect, his Mediterranean looks. "You could be Italian," Lydia remarks at one point during the meal, regarding him in the candle's glow. Gerald remembers a bar of French chocolate he bought on his way home, and this is unwrapped, broken apart, and passed around the table. Eventually the talk turns to India. Gerald asks questions about the recent rise of Hindu fundamentalism, a topic Gogol knows little about. Lydia talks at length about Indian carpets and miniatures. Maxine about a college class she had once taken on Buddhist stupas. They have never known a person who has been to Calcutta. Gerald has an Indian colleague at work who just went to India for his honeymoon. He had brought back spectacular photographs of a place built on a lake. Was that in Calcutta? "That's Udaipur," Gogol tells them. "I've never been there. Calcutta's in the east, closer to Thailand." Lydia peers into the salad bowl, fishing out a stray piece of lettuce and eating it with her fingers. She seems more relaxed now, quicker to smile, her cheeks rosy from the wine. "What's Calcutta like? Is it beautiful?" The question surprises him. He is accustomed to people asking about the poverty, about the beggars and the heat. "Parts of it are beautiful," he tells her. "There's a lot of lovely Victorian architecture left over from the British, but most of it is decaying." "That sounds like Venice," Gerald says. Are there canals? Only during the monsoon. That's when the streets flood. I guess that's the closest it comes to resembling Venice. I want to go to Calcutta, Maxine says, as if this has been a thing denied to her all her life. She gets up and walks over to the stove. I feel like tea. Who wants tea? But Gerald and Lydia decide against tea tonight. There is an Claudius video they want to watch before bed. Without tending to the dishes, they stand up, Gerald taking their 2 glasses and the rest of the wine. Good night, dear, Lydia says, kissing Gogo lightly on the cheek, and then their footsteps creak noisily up the stairs. I suppose you have never been subjected to someone's parents on the first date before, Maxine says, once they are alone, sipping milky cups of Lapsang South Chong from heavy white mugs. I enjoyed meeting them. They are charming. That's one way of putting it. They remain a while at the table, talking, the sound of the rain echoing quietly in the enclosed space behind the house. The candles shrink to stubs, and specks of wax drip onto the table. Silas, who has been softly pacing on the floor, comes and presses his head against Gogol's leg, looking up at him, wagging his tail. Gogol bends over, pats him tentatively. You've never had a dog, have you? Maxine says, observing him. No. Didn't you ever want one? When I was a kid. But my parents never wanted the responsibility. Plus, we had to go to India every couple of years. He realizes it's the first time he has mentioned his parents to her, his past. He wonders if perhaps she'll ask him more about these things. Instead, she says, Silas likes you. He's very picky. He looks at her, watching as she undoes her hair, letting it hang loose for a moment over her shoulders before wrapping it thoughtlessly around her head. She looks back at him, smiling. Once again, he is aware of her nakedness beneath the cardigan. I should go, he says, but he is glad that she accepts his offer to help her clean up before leaving. They loiter over the task, loading the dishwasher, wiping down the table and the butcher block island, washing and drying the pots and pans. They agree to go to the film forum on Saturday afternoon to see Antony double feature that Lydia and Gerald have recently been to and recommended over dinner. I'll walk you to the subway, Maxine says when they are finished, putting a leash around Silas. He needs to go out. They go up to the parlor level, put their coats. He hears the sound of a television faintly through the ceiling. He pauses at the foot of the stairs. I forgot to thank your parents, he says. For what? For having me over dinner. She links elbows with him. You can thank them next time.